Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Las Gardenias honey processed Guatemala from Cabra. And there's the box right there. And I believe once upon a time their boxes used to say Aarhus, but the box says roasted in Copenhagen, so we will go with based out of Copenhagen, Denmark. And a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel multiple times before, and a coffee roaster that I haven't necessarily been the biggest fan of in the past, but given their standing as one of the most well-known and popular coffee roasters in all of Europe, they're one that I continue to revisit in the hopes that I might be able to find the allure of their coffees, as I found their wash to be a little too tame, I found their naturals to be a little too heavy, so I figure, hey, why not split the difference and go with a honey processed one. And I don't think we've ever actually reviewed any honey processed Guatemala, so kind of two birds on this one. Looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 29. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 199 degrees Fahrenheit, or I believe that's 92 to 93 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for Cabra is interesting because once upon a time they used to be one of the true Nordic light coffee roasters, but they definitely roast a lot more on the developed side of things. It reminds me a little bit more of something that's akin to a, I don't want to say medium, but definitely a lot more on the developed side of that light medium for the roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 13, first impression, and that's what I said, the cup was brewing a little bit more developed than expected. The most distinct thing within the cup itself was a heavier fruit component reminiscent of the natural fermentiness that I've experienced from, well, natural processed coffees in general. Moderately heavy berry with a slight nutty aspect, so it left an okay first impression. Not necessarily my favorite. I think one thing I've always really liked about the changes that Cabra have made is the fact that they don't really put any sort of flavor notes on their coffee. Like this one basically just says floral and balanced, so that kind of gives you an opportunity to come up with your own descriptors, and that's kind of the descriptor I had from this first day. Not necessarily the best first impression, not necessarily what I'm looking for from this coffee. But we continue on to day 15, as it was a little better through the Chemex. It was a little bit more clean with a little less of the fermenty aspects, but yet again, it's just kind of heavy berry component that's really dominating the cup with this slightly cleaner chocolate nutty aspect within it. It just very much reminded me of a natural processed Ethiopian coffee in general, the more modern natural processed Ethiopia that has a lot of those heavier characteristics. So still to this day, not necessarily enjoying this coffee. We continue on to day 17 as ran it back through the Chemex, and the slightly fermenting natural berry aspect is on the forefront yet again. I think it's kind of at this moment I decided that I really need to dilute this recipe. I really need to dilute this coffee. And given that Cabra has one of the more strong ratios, I believe it's something around a 15.25 or a 15.65 to 1, I didn't necessarily feel like going in that direction was going to help this coffee. Wasn't getting too much depth from within the cup as I continued to feel the slightly darker berry aspect. It reminded me of maybe a darker grape with a slight bit of nuttiness, so yet again, very reminiscent of modern fermenting natural processed Ethiopian coffees. Day 19 lowered the temperatures and the concentration, and I saw moderately improved results, so this is why I kind of settled on that recipe we went with, as it's slightly cleaner with a lot less of those robust fermenty aspects and a much cleaner chocolate, a much more slight grape as opposed to the overly sort of heavy berryness that was coming within this cup, and a sweeter nuttiness, which was also a little bit of a selling point. Really kind of cleaning up this cup of coffee seemed to do it a lot of justice. Day 21 made the same adjustments in the V60, and it didn't really work in the V60 as it continued to remain really heavy. So even with the lower concentration and with the lower temperatures, the cup continued to just remain, well, just heavier, fermenty berries and robust chocolate yet again. So I decided that the Chemex was doing a good job of maybe stripping away a lot of those negative aspects, and diluting the recipe was really kind of toning that down, as this cup of coffee, when you allow it to be at its maximum, you're getting so many of those really strong fermenty aspects. Day 23 back through the Chemex, and you can definitely still taste the dark fermenty aspects within the cup, but it is much more toned down at this point. There's almost a spirit-like fermentiness, so it did remind me of something that you might experience from like maybe a rum or something, while the heavy berry and chocolate remains on the forefront. Slightly sweet nuttiness yet again, so again, that's maybe one of the slightly better aspects within this coffee, but we continue to persist on day 25 as kept at temperatures low, the ratio again low, and it keeps the cup slightly cleaner. Cup is at its best when it does cool down, and you get this kind of bright citric berry aspect within it as well. A little bit more of the chocolate, a little bit more of the nuttiness, getting a little bit more sweetness. I think one thing that was really important with this coffee was it was probably going to continue to trend in the direction of getting stronger and stronger and much more pronounced. So finding a recipe that could really tone down what you were expecting from this coffee going forward did seem to help, as on day 27, final notes we have the temperatures continued to lower. I actually went even lower, all the way down to 199. So 199. Originally brewed at 205, then went down to about 203, then went to 201, and then by the end I'm like, okay, let's go 199. And it continued to help the cup, as it's slightly reminiscent yet again of grape jelly. And then there's the chocolate that felt a little bit more structured. So maybe going even lower on this coffee might have helped it a little bit more. But there is still a pretty heavy component to the cup of coffee in general, but I have seen improvements. So I was able to make a lot of adjustments that made this coffee a lot more enjoyable. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And a bunch of level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We'll start with the body at a level 4. Yeah, this cup of coffee had a lot of body, which is really interesting given that it was run through the Chemex, and it is on the slightly lower side of the level 4, but there was a fair bit of body within this coffee, so I could definitely see that. The finish, level 4, yeah, typically when you have something that's this fermenty, it's really hard to kind of keep it below that level 4 mark, and in this case, I kind of wish it was a little bit less lasting. So seeing it at the level 4 mark, something I definitely agree with. And then the berry fruit level 4, it's interesting that the notes they have listed on here are floral and balanced, as that's not necessarily my experience with this coffee. Definitely much more on the heavier berry side of things, as that was a pretty distinct characteristic within this coffee. Additional components, got a fair bit of smokiness to it, and maybe a little high on that level 3 mark, but it definitely did feel, as mentioned, right from the onset, a little bit more developed than I was expecting, and that's given I'd had some, previous experiences with the Cabra that also kind of skewed this direction. Spiciness, level 3, there was a little bit of spice to it, and I feel like that's kind of noted as well as in the savory aspect to it. And then the saltiness, level 3, that's to kind of highlight and accentuate the nutty component that I was able to attain from this coffee. Sweetness, level 3, that's what is really frustrating, is given just how heavy and fermenty this coffee was, the least that you can do to kind of balance it out is maybe have the sweetness at a level 4. But even then, it was fermenty while lacking the sweetness, which is a little tricky for me. And then the acidity was in equal measure. While in theory it could have been higher at that level 3 mark, it still was equal to a sweetness that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of to begin with. So they're on equal footing. And then of course the last thing is the cleanliness, which is at a level 2. I genuinely thought that since this was honey processed coffee, minimum we were going to get was a level 3 mark. So kind of having this really fermenty aspect to the coffee was definitely a detracting factor for me. And I agree with that too. Honestly, even drinking this coffee today, I still feel like I agree with so many of these factors. I know this is one of those coffees you could say, well, if you let it rest a little longer, I don't think it was going to change the fact that this coffee was always fermenty. It was fermenty from the onset, and even to the last day with any sort of adjustments I made to tone that down, that fermenty aspect, it was probably going to continue to remain that way, if not get a little bit more pronounced with a little bit more time. Other than that, yeah, I kind of like the way that this tasting wheel looks. I think it's pretty much what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I think the biggest takeaway I want to have for this coffee is that it's interesting. Honey processed coffees have also gone a little bit in the direction of the fermenting naturals, because I remember once upon a time they were a good middle ground, because naturals used to be a little bit more clean, and as a result, honey processed coffees were even more clean than that, and they gave you a good balance of better clarity while a little bit more flavor, so they weren't necessarily as tame as the wash processed coffees, while at the same time having more cleanliness than the natural. And that's why I used to really like honey processed coffees, but I've had a kind of negative run of honey processed coffees in general, and this one is another one of those because it was every bit as heavy and fermenty as a lot of natural processed coffees. So A lot of the detracting factors were the fact it lacked that clarity. That's the biggest sticking point for me, being a little heavier on the berry side of things, lacking the sweetness I was looking for. But this continues to remain a little bit in line with my Le Cabra experiences. I haven't found a coffee from them that I necessarily enjoy, and I've even tried some of their really high-end offerings at some coffee shops. So I'm going to persist. I'm sure I'll find something sooner or later, but for now, this one wasn't necessarily my favorite either. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I think if you do like the heavier aspects yet again, and that's kind of the direction I've been pushing people towards for a while, this one's a pretty nice fit in that sense. Again, it does have more of the robust chocolates, it does have more of that heavier berry, and it does have a nice added bit of nuttiness to it, and I think that was the most defining factor. So if you like those things, the thing that will kind of separate this one from other coffees is having a little bit of that nuttiness and a little bit of the smokiness to kind of contrast it as well. But yeah, for the most part, I think I will leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. Honestly, would still love to know people's thoughts and impressions of Le Cabra, because I've heard some of the same things that I've echoed, that they haven't necessarily been to the standard that a lot of people are expecting. So unfortunately, this one wasn't necessarily mine either. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Las Gardenias honey processed Guatemala from Le Cabra. Thank you for watching.